All right, good morning. Good morning, welcome. This is the ACE Working Group, and we're off to a start here as the first session here on Monday morning. Good morning, my name is Roman Dinedu. I co-chair with Jim Shaw. Why don't we get started? As a reminder, as an official meeting, the note well applies. There are a number of BCPs here at play. If you have any questions, by all means, ask us, or Ben could appear as our AD. We have this agenda here. This is almost the same that was posted on the mailing list. Would anyone like to bash what we have here? Okay, I take that as a no. So before we dive into kind of some of the specific presentations, let's talk status update. So a couple things have happened since we last got together in person. There was quite a lot of robust activity at the hackathon. We did a working group last call on the CWT proof of possession kind of draft, and that's still in flight. There was a request for an early registration for a co-op media type that the chairs are still working on. We also met virtually for an interop event, and most importantly, kind of congrats to the author team. We got RFC 8392 published, so we're making kind of progress. Big picture wise, we are largely on schedule because we've been updating the milestones. This is kind of where we stand. So closest up for us is getting the proof of possession draft done and some of the framework drafts done. Are there any reactions to what's happening in the milestones about what we should change or tailor based on what's there now? Okay. Honest, you're staring at it very intently. It's a small font. All right. In that case, we'll move from our administrative kind of portion directly into some of the conversation. So, Mike, kind of you're up.
Do we still have the, oh my gosh, I will back off. Good morning, Montreal. I am Mike Jones from Microsoft, and I'm here to talk about the proof of possession key representation for Seaboard Web Tokens. So, quick background. At IETF 99 a year ago, we decided we could do this fast. It's a simple spec that provides the CBOR CWT equivalent of RFC 7800, which is the JOT proof of possession key representation. As Roman just noted, we finished the CWT in the last few months, which is great. I'll note that like CWT, the proof of possession key is needed for some of the other work happening here in ACE and other places. We did conduct the working group last call. The authors, including Samuel, were pretty diligent about responding to and addressing all the comments. I will say that the one place where we didn't always do what was asked was when some of the comments requested deviations from the model in 7800. And so we had a lot of discussions about that, and in the end kept things entirely parallel. So this is my last slide. I don't think I'm going to take the 15 minutes. I think where we are, and this is for the chairs to decide, is I think it's time for a shepherd review, and indeed to appoint a shepherd and take us to the next steps, because I think this is fully baked and ready to go. It's on.
Hello, 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 hello. Carsten Bormann. So I have a 30,000-foot comment that is not actionable, but it's still a comment. And I think we need to think about this. One of the ideas of COSI was to use the work that was done by COSI as much as possible to be able to complete quickly. And then at some point we noticed there are reasons to have some deviations. So that's why COSI is not an exact copy of COSI as originally envisioned, but is a little bit different. And the main reason is that the domain of application we have for COSI is devices. So they don't have a human in front of them. They have to make decisions based on the data they have. So I think that the main difference between COSI and COSI is that in COSI we just have this incredible craving for precision. And so now we did CWT and CW proof of possession. And I think we still have this need. I don't know how to fully resolve it. We see from the certificate work that you actually can work with very little precision. So things can be made to work, and then you have security accidents, and then you fix things and fine. But maybe we want to have more nailed down semantics for what we are doing in the COSI CWT space. And therefore, I think starting the definition of CWT and CW proof of possession essentially based on what is from our point of view already a legacy, which is COSI and the JWT proof of possession work, might be a bit of a problem. Of course, it's also an opportunity because things have been learned there, and so that's great. But I think it's really important that we spend the energy and understand what the things that we are standardizing with mean in terms of security.
Sure, great points. I should note that my slides do oversimplify the situation in saying that it remains exactly parallel. There's a backstory here, which many of you will remember from a year ago, is that there were actually two different drafts that did essentially the same thing. I wrote an individual draft, and Ludwig and crew, including I think yourself, Kirsten, as part of the OAuth profile for ACE, also did a treatment of proof of possession keys. The interesting thing to me, and in fact, to me, the confirmation is that we're already on the right track, is what Ludwig did and what I did were essentially exactly the same, including deleting the parts of 7800 that weren't applicable in embedded use cases. In particular, 7800 has a way of referencing keys via a URL as a JWK set. And both of us independently decided that's probably not applicable in the embedded space, and both of us deleted it. And so I think we already have pretty good confirmation that the parts that we kept are the parts that are going to be useful for embedded systems. And indeed, I think we're in good shape that way. We did think about the application domain and not just blindly copy everything. Thank you.
Hannes, one item where this topic of alignment with the COSI work came up was the use of multiple keys in sort of binding into multiple keys, and I was initially in favor of relaxing it. Later, changed my mind because I didn't see or didn't have a use case to support that functionality. So, which in some sense made sure that there's alignment again. But of course, those would be extensions that could be defined, and maybe if it's a good use case for the CWD, it could as well be a good use case also for the corresponding JSON-based format. But I just didn't have that use case, so it's probably easier to then just mint a new token and pop token and then present it instead of munching multiple keys into one representation. One item that I was hoping we could discuss, and maybe Jim or Roman is going to bring this up, was this key ID debate that we had, which I think we sort of we definitely discussed it for quite a while on the mailing list, but there wasn't a clear conclusion as far as I can tell on that part.
So let's see. You made 2 points, and I'll respond to them in turn. One was the multiple keys representation, and both 7800 and our draft do say how you could represent multiple pop keys by defining a new claim to hold the additional key. I mean, it's the case that any application, if there's multiple keys, is going to have identifiers or ways to distinguish what the keys are. And so asking for there to be a claim to represent the additional keys is not a burden on the application. In fact, it helps meet the application needs. So I think we, after discussing that, decided we were in a good place with that. Now, with respect to the comments that Jim raised about use of key ID to identify which pop key to use. In fact, Hannes, you did write some text which we put into a new section on operational considerations, which described that, and in fact, we then revised it with Jim, described that if you're in a context that there's multiple keys and they're from distinct spaces, you're going to need to keep the lookup of the keys in those distinct spaces so that it can't be possible for you to be tricked into using a key that doesn't apply to the application domain. That being said, I believe particularly in the embedded world, you're very likely to be in a 0 or 1 key situation. And so while it's good to cover this in security considerations, I think for most of our applications, it doesn't even apply.
I cannot say that I felt that the whole issue of reference by key ID was adequately addressed in the document. I think that there's a whole lot of issues that haven't been thought about that are problematic and need to be thought through and documented far clearer than what is in there today. There may be a couple of other issues. I think there was one other issue in my review that I did not feel was correctly dealt with yet either, but I can't remember off the top of my head what it is.
So, Jim, is there an issue besides the potential for an attacker to trick you into using the wrong key if there's multiple keys from distinct spaces that you think we also need to describe, or do you just want that issue described better?
I think that the concept that you're going to end up with a single AS authorizing, doing all the authorizations on an RS is probably not correct. And I think that those ASs may need to cooperate, which is not a case which is covered.
Yeah, that's way beyond even classic OAuth.
Yeah, no, this is far beyond classic OAuth. I would agree with that. I mean, OAuth has a very, very, very thin security model, which we need to expand in this world to some degree. The issue is not one of tricking you to using the wrong key. The issue is one of tricking you to give me permissions I shouldn't have. So those are very different statements of what the problem is.
Okay, maybe you and I and others that are interested can put that down on a napkin so that I can understand the flow that you're concerned about.
Do we feel we have the time to expose that quickly for the benefit of the whole room? Ludwig Seitz, right? By the way, I tried to do that on the mailing list at some point. My understanding of what Jim thinks is the problem. So I can try and do that very, very quickly. The problem he thinks is you get an AS to issue you a token, bind to a key, let's call it A, with a key identifier 1. And then you have an attacker using another AS that gets a token bind to a key identifier that's also 1, but this attacker is all using a key B. And then me, the client, using my token bound to key A, submits that token to a resource server, and the resource server stores that and stores the key identifier 1 linked to that token, or rather to the key, the first possession of that token. And then comes the attacker having another token linked to the key identifier 1, and somehow, and that's the point where I don't follow Jim, somehow gets to trick the resource server to accept that token and key B that is also identified by a key identifier 1, and thus gains the access rights of the first token. That is the problem that I understood from Jim's argument, and I don't see this last step, how this is supposed to happen. How the attacker tricks the resource server to accept a second key linked to the same key identifier of a key that the resource server already knows. I don't think that's happening. Or if it's happening, then you have a very, very bad resource server.
Right, and the beauty of cryptography is if you're tricked into using the wrong key will not validate the proof of possession because the signature doesn't match, even if coincidentally key identifiers happen to be the same. It's underlying keys which validate the signature.
Regardless of that being said, I agree with Jim that this is an issue we need to document. I'm not 100% sure it needs to go into just this document.
Indeed, one of my questions was, does the OAuth profile document for ACE address Jim's use case of having multiple cooperating authorization servers? Jim is nodding yes. You're looking puzzled like no.
This is honest. I think, following on what Ludwig said, this document, the CWT POP token, is very limited in its functionality.
That's right.
It may be used in a non OAuth space context. So it's really just about putting the key, having a structure to put the key in there, nothing else.
That's right.
And I think the described attack scenario, I think this is something that should be documented, in my opinion, in the ACE OAuth document. I think there it fits better because there you actually have an authorization server, there you have the resource server, and potentially multiple of them. So I think it's just a question of also document management. I think that would be useful there. I don't think it's a, so from what Ludwig explained, I don't think it's a concern because the key IDs don't stand on its own and they actually tie to the party issuing them. But
that's right.
But still, we've seen with even simpler cases that implementation can make mistakes, or implementers can make mistakes. So it's definitely worthwhile to highlight those.
This is Russ Housley. I came up here to disagree with Thomas. So because the collision in the key identifier has different consequences and different uses, I agree that the OAuth document should document those there. But there should be a warning in this document that says, if you use this, wherever you're using it, talk about the consequences of the key identifier condition.
So Russ, have you read the new section which Hannes wrote on operational considerations that does in fact describe the need to partition key spaces?
Yes, but the whole point is, what if someone maliciously was purposely violating that? What are the consequences? That's all you want them to document in the using spec. So tell them here to do that.
Okay. Jim, are you coming back for more?
Got it. So I would like to react, since the next step is for the Shepherd review is what you're proposing. So I'm going to be the Shepherd. So on Thursday, I dropped something on the mailing list where I try to deconflict all the comments that came in on -2, squint at everything that was in kind of 3 and line them up. And there were a lot of comments, so I may be off by kind of 1 or 2. But my assessment, and I'm kind of staring at it here, is there were things in 3 categories, which were, I think there were things raised in the working group last call that I could not see manifested in changes in -03, and on the list I've enumerated those. There were also discussions of changes that would be dropped into 03 that when I saw the text, it looked like it actually addressed the comments, but it did not make it into the text. And then on the last one was this issue we've been talking about here, kind of in the mic line. So I think what would really help proceed the -03 to the next stage of maturity is if you could walk through that list and say, hey, Roman, you missed this. This was actually kind of closed, and we get consensus from those that brought up kind of the issue to say, yes, this addresses kind of my issue. So I think there's about
So you
9
sent,
things on the list.
you sent that to the list Thursday?
Yeah, it's on Thursday.
Okay, I'll look for that then.
Please. I think that may help us get around kind of this issue of, is it closed, kind of, is it not? But but it does leave open, so I think there's some mechanical things to do with the vast majority of those, but there is still discussion required on this, what do we say, are we adequately covered in the operational section about the key IDs?
Right, and my request would be, given that we attempted to address it by adding specific text, if people believe that additional things need to be said, please provide text of what you think needs to be said so that it's actionable.
That's fair. Okay.
Great, thanks all.
Thank you. All right, Peter, you're up.
Thanks. Oh.
All right, sorry, I'll figure this out.
It's been a long.
Maybe try it this way.
Yes. Ah,
It's looking like it's not strongly exactly. I will fix it.
it's not strongly aligned. No, it's weakly aligned. Good. Okay.
It's a light outline.
Yeah, okay. Oof. Okay. So I will present the EST over co-op S draft, which has been presented already some time. I'm very grateful for all the comments we got back from the working group. It has really helped, was really helpful. Thank you very much. So we are happy about all this. This draft proposes co-op over DTLS, where the original EST used HTTP and TLS. So I think it's clear this is meant for reduced resource devices. There are 2 driving areas, secure bootstrapping and having this distribution of identities, which are the 2 driving use cases behind this draft. Yes. So we have a few major updates since the IETF 101. The first 2, I will have 2 additional slides to talk about them, and the others I just mentioned them. So there is a case where you may have delays, so you ask for some approval that the certificate is correct, and then there may be problems, and somebody by hand has to verify that things are okay. So you may have delays, not of a few milliseconds, but of seconds, minutes. So that is the part we're going to handle. On the other card, we have the multi-part payload. I will also say a little bit more in one of the slides, and for which has been done a request for publications. Thank you very much, which was nice. We have improved the examples. I mean, improving the text was sometimes ambiguous, and we have made it nicer, and sometimes the payload was not completely correct, so we handled that. We have a section with parameter values. We promised it, and actually there have been some implementations. They have actually looked at what kind of parameters to select, and there are some recommendations about what to do. There is a major, the word proxy was wrongly used when going between HTTP and co-op, and it has to be a registrar, which is recognized. We have improved the text, and that has, so it looks much better now, and it is more correct. The server key generation, last time there were some questions about it, whoever needs this, etc. These, I think, are now handled in the text, and also the way to handle server key generation has been written down. So thank you for the comment there, Hannes. Action has been taken. So, okay. Now, this is long delay handling. To the left, you will see what we did in the last draft, and to the right, you see we have in the current draft. In the original draft, when you do a post, you cannot do an observe. So what you do, we have done a post. The server recognizes that it has to wait a few minutes, and it returns a location. And what you can do is a get with an observe, and then wait till you get the notification back. All nice horky-dorky. But the problem was that when implementing it and doing the use cases that we were looking at, then it was noticed that the registrar we want to have very small, and the registrar, if it goes from the co-op to the HTTP, has to remember all these things, the observations which are going on, etc., which is a lot of state. And we wanted to get rid of that state. So there has been a new, much simpler way to handle this. And so in the current text, what we do is we do the post, and the server recognizes, look here, this is going to take some time, and it returns an error and tells you, you wait so much time. And then after some time, the client resends completely the same payload again to the server, which may be ready then or is not ready, and then says, look here, error max age. And this goes on until finally the server is ready or the client gives up. It is much simpler, but the disadvantage is that you send again the same payload again in the post. Any comments on this? Was that clear? Yeah. Okay. Fine. Thanks. Multi-part payload. For example, in one of the actions, the server key generation, the returned payload is composed of 2 parts with different media types. This was not possible in COBA before, thanks to the collaboration with Karsten and writing a new draft. What we now have, that you can have different payloads in the different media types in the payloads, and we do this by using a CBOR array, where in the first 2, where we have pairs, the first one gives the content format number, and then it gives the payload, and then the next part in the CBOR array, content format 2, payload 2 belonging there, etc. And we have worked it out in the EST co-op as example. For example, here we have a very small, we have 2 content formats, 42 and 0, and we have a very short payload just to show what it might look like. We are happy, we think this is fantastic. I mean, the guys who are implementing it say, this is also very nice and handy. Any comments? No? Great. So what are we going to do more to finalize this draft? So we have the early content format assignment has been requested. It's going on. Very good. Thank you very much. Again, we want to update the example payloads because we have the implementations. So I made some example payloads, but I constructed them from the EST publications, and they are not very correct, I'm afraid. And we want to prepare an interop with Ries, Nexus, Cisco, ARM, I hope, and Sanderman. Oh, sorry. Okay. I hope that this can be done in the coming 3 months. That is our hope. And then we get results back. Yeah? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Any feedback, comments?
Mohit,
Hey.
Mohit, could you go back to the slide where you explain this error, that it can send this error before sending a GET?
This one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can't I just block this error from the server and you will still run into the same problem?
Yeah.
So if I'm an attacker and I don't want the client to know this, that is it this post is a confirmable call?
Mm-hmm. What I see here is that actually you may wait and you have the error max is correct, and then after the error max you come back, you get back your result. But it may well be that the max age is not correct, and you want to do it a second time. And if at the end the client says, I give up because this takes too long, say half a day, it just gives up, and that's the end of it. Was that the question?
Is the post that you send it's a confirmable post?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Good.
This is Hannes, on the multi-path payload, why did you have to introduce this multi-path functionality? I didn't quite understand.
Oh, for the server key generator, now I have to work very hard. There are two parts. I think first you get a certificate request with a certain content format, and then you get an additional response in another content format. They are different.
Okay, but one comes from the client.
They both come from the server. So the client has one content format, he does the request, and then comes back information from the server, which tells you about what is coming out in a content format, and then tells you the result in another content format.
So normally, the way how it worked was the client sent a certificate signing request, and then it gets the certificate back. That was the original sort of model. That didn't require multi-path.
No, but in the server key generation, if you look it up, there are two parts, which unfortunately I do not know by heart anymore, but which are very different content formats.
So okay, I suspect you are talking about the fact that you pass the certificate as well as the private key along, and you need to put them into different format.
Absolutely.
Needless to say that I was in huge favor of, or not huge favor is my understatement. I wasn't in favor at all to define any functionality that does server-side key generation and passes the keys around, because it has all these sort of problems and voids all the benefits of public key cryptography.
Yeah.
But I guess you guys,
okay,
it's like insecurity by design.
Okay. Yeah. If I understand you correctly, as well, you think that there is the additional overhead which is generated with the CBOR array? Okay. Oh, I see. Okay. Fine.
Additional comments, feedback?
If you want to be full compatibility, yes, I'm afraid so. We have not said that any of the parts which we do we are either mandatory or optional. It's not in the text. So we may think about that, right?
Hannes again. So maybe, I don't know if there's a possibility to return an error message if the client requests for something, a feature like this one, and the server then doesn't provide that functionality. So in that sense, it would still be interoperable, it would just not work. I think that would be good. And I still think that the argument which sort of led to the introduction of that feature is also a little bit dubious, because the argument was that IoT devices can't generate random numbers, which I will send a link to the list where I explain on how to use hardware-based random number generation on low-end IoT devices, and there are actually lots of those chips out there and that do that.
Yes, but what I know is that we are not only going to handle new devices, but there are also old devices out there, and they have to collaborate. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Next up, Ludwig, you're going to talk about framework.
So, whoa, that's about the right distance, right? I'm not booming your ears out. Great. So I'm mostly going to talk about the framework, but as the chairs had on their agenda, this also relates to the two profiles that we have adopted, the DTLS profile and the score profile. Less happened on those two profiles, therefore I don't have it on the title slide. So we did a number of updates since IETF 101. We're now at version 13. We were at version 10 at IETF 101. The first one was we discovered a few CBORD data type errors when we did the impromptu interop at IETF 101, Jim, Olaf, and me. And we discovered that in the listings of different parameters and claims, we had some of the CBORD data types wrong. So we fixed that, and there was a new boilerplate. So that was a pretty small update. This one was a bit larger. So first of all, we had error handling kind of baked in a section where it didn't really belong. So we moved that to an own section. We had the possibility when you were identifying profiles to identify them with the long strings that are the descriptive names of them. I removed that possibility because it didn't feel useful, and I'm now requiring that you use the abbreviation. And you can still use the string identifiers in like descriptive text or metadata or whatever. Then there was a comment by Jim that we might need to inform a resource server about which public key to use if it has several. So I allowed the rsconf, which describes the public key of a resource server, parameter to come into an introspection response. So when the resource server does an introspection on an access token, the authorization server can inform it which of its different public keys to use to authenticate to the client. That's the idea of that one. The next one is if you don't do introspection, you might still want to have, might still have this scenario. So I also allowed this to be used as a claim in an access token, so that when processing the access token, the resource server can determine, oh, okay, towards the client wielding this access token, I need to authenticate with this public key. So that's the bullets 3 and 4. Then I had comments from Mike about the label ranges that were different. So not the label actual numbers of different labels, but the ranges. And I aligned that so that it's the same now. Also, there was a question on how error responses were to be protected or whether, and I added some text basically saying the profile must specify that, whether and how you protect error responses. In some cases, it's not possible because you do not have a security association. In some other cases, it is. And in some cases, you want to send like some stuff that is visible and some other stuff that is encrypted and only readable for someone who has the right security association. And finally, we did a number of changes based on something that Hannes wanted to have that allows profiles to specify other payload formats than CBORD. Because when we initially created that document, we were assuming CoAP and CBORD. And as Hannes pointed out, and as we then saw when people proposed the MQTT profile, people are looking at other transport formats and looking at other payload formats. So to the best of my knowledge, this should now be allowed by the framework. I might have overlooked something, but I hope not. Go ahead, Hannes.
Yeah, just one short clarification. So the CBORD, so the fact that there's a CBORD token, that is unchanged. So, but the use of CWOR as it's related to the use in co-op, that was the point. So the transport protocol may have its own restrictions of what it can use, and that's where it's related to. So the use case there is you have a client that runs ordinary OAuth with HTTP, but uses the HTTP stuff as co-op is defined just to request a different token. I think.
Yeah.
So that was.
So,
so it's nothing against
yeah.
itself.
So for example, you would have a client running the regular OAuth, but getting a CWT instead of a JOT, and then using this JOT as in the ACE framework. So that was just a number of changes that led to some sentences that sound a bit painful to me, but the idea was painful because they are a little bit convoluted, but the idea was to allow profiles to specify these kind of things. The last update, go ahead. Should I switch back?
Just a follow-up on this one. So this is actually a topic that we will have a discussion on Thursday in the OWASP working group meeting, because there's a little bit of, not just on this topic, but also related to this with the Bob token usage, there's a little bit of overlap between now the work we do here in ACE and the OWASP working group, so we'll have a dedicated discussion slot to speak about that, and if anyone who's interested in that should come to the Thursday OWASP meeting.
You're preempting my next slide. No problem. So the next point was review by Jim, I think. Mostly all these changes are due to review by Jim, and he pointed out that the term we're using, resource information, was prone to misunderstandings. Just for those who want to delve in a bit of nostalgia, we called that client information initially because I was thinking it's information for the client. Then someone complained, "Ooh, this is misunderstandable. It could be interpreted as information about the client." Oh, great. No, we don't want that. So we called it resource information, and then comes the equivalent argument. So Jim suggested access information. I implemented that change because it's more neutral. You cannot make that argument anymore. I don't have a very strong opinion about that. If someone wants to argue it, I'm happy to hear. But I changed that for the moment because Jim's argument has some merit. Next thing, there was a section about discovery of the authorization server. So when a client does an unauthorized request to a resource server, it gets back some discovery information. And there were some points in that section that weren't totally clear. There are still some points left we discovered. And we're going to address those as well. We removed some text we had about a discussion that was ongoing, I think, a year ago about how constrained devices could measure time or not. And there was some text saying that we have this ongoing discussion, which is no longer true. We don't have it anymore. So I removed that. I think the consensus at that time was we're most likely to have wall clock time. So we can measure ticks, but we cannot be sure that we have synchronized clocks. And then there was a number of editorial changes, mostly commas missing when I wrote that Hannes added. So thank you very much, Hannes. There was very extensive review of the grammar and syntax in the document. So that was the last update. Since then, we've had a review by Jim, and we've had 2 interrupts. A few issues were discovered, which I don't have on my slides because the interrupt was during the hackathon, and I made the slides on Thursday, I think. So here are the discussion points before the new discussion points that we have come up with. First of all, the key identifier collisions. I think we already covered this, so I'm going to skip that. Alignment with OAuth, that was what Hannes preempted me on telling. There's 2 parameters that are pretty close to each other, which are overlapping somewhat. There is this old OAuth draft that is expired to the best of my knowledge. The OAuth P, what was it called? Distribution draft, thank you, which defines a parameter called alg, which is intended to specify the proof of possession algorithm. And in the ACE framework draft, we have a parameter called profile, which does something rather similar. But my point would be that it does a bit more because it defines not only the proof of possession method, but also the communication protocol and the communication security protocol you're supposed to use. So I think there is merit to the point that we should discuss how to align this. And until recently, the work in OAuth was dormant, so I pulled large parts of this key distribution draft into the ACE framework. I'm happy to put them out again if it doesn't delay the progress of the ACE framework. So if OAuth can move really fast with that, then great. Less text in this already pretty long framework document. I'm all for it. But I'm not convinced at the moment that this is the case, that OAuth really will move forward fast on that. So please convince me and I will be happy to oblige and remove the overlapping parts. Yes. Then there was a discussion point brought up by Mike. So what we're doing is we're defining abbreviations for claim names and parameter names and for some common parameter values. And Mike was arguing that we were using the low-digit byte numbers for this abbreviation in a wasteful way. Now, perhaps, Karsten, you can say, when does the CBOR representation switch from 1 byte to 2? I think it's at 255 or something. 24? Yes, integers.
The shortest numbers you can express are -24.
I see, okay. So these are the most valuable ones then, because they are very short. That kind of kills part of my argumentation, because I was thinking of the 1 byte abbreviations, which obviously go a bit farther. Still, all the parameters that are currently in the framework are either parameters defined by OAuth or defined by RFC 7800 and the confirmation draft that we have, plus this profile and rsconf parameter that we are defining. So I'm absolutely open to discussion which of those parameters are unimportant enough to merit a larger abbreviation. We should definitely do that. And then we should select those that get the really small ones from -2 to +24 that are the ones we use a lot.
Carsten, moment, you can waste a lot of time discussing these things. I mean, these are tweaks somewhere to the third or fourth order. So,
yeah, I agree.
I think just somebody should do that. Write up what a good decision would be, and then you should just.
I can.
Mike Jones, Microsoft. My suggestion is that you work with the distinguished experts for CWT claim registration and ask them, or make a proposal maybe of, these are the values that we think are general purpose claims which should be registered in the lowest range, in the mid-range, and the high range. And just get their feedback. I mean, to the extent that you've tried to align this with CWT claims, which I think you should,
Yeah, it is.
then you should be planning to register it. And so talk to the designated experts now rather than when the document's never done.
Good. Last point raised by Jim. We were at some point in the document talking about this discovery of the authorization server, and we were saying in a little bit of a nonchalant way that yeah, if you don't do this unauthorized request and get back the AS information, you could also look it up in a resource directory. It like this without thinking it through to the end. Jim correctly pointed out there are no definitions in the resource directory drafts or in any other drafts for security attributes. And luckily, Karsten has a point on the agenda about exactly that, I think. So we're going to be talking about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We have a lot of discussion about this issue of how a resource server can point the client to information about how to get the authorization. Generally, it's pretty easy to put things into RD. You just define a relation type. So if you have something that describes the authorization requirements or something, then you could define a relation type authorized by or something like that, and just point to a place elsewhere where you can get information about that. So that would be a good activity looking at how this information would look like, because it would also take some pressure out of the need to be very comprehensive in the set of information that the resource server provides when it gets an unauthorized request.
My question would then be, do we want this to be in the framework draft, or do we want to specify an additional draft, say like resource directory, security, link attributes, I think they're called.
Well,
I'm not
relation type, but
the relation types. Thank you.
yes, I think it's a worthwhile independent effort.
I tend to agree, but
Not necessarily be synchronized with everything. So of course there should be something basic about what a resource server does in case of an unauthorized request in the framework.
that it is.
But we can always provide other channels for the information and putting the relation type into the resource profile if we want.
The way I've addressed this currently, because I addressed this comment to the best of my ability, is to remove the explicit reference to resource directories, since we don't have anything there, and just state like, you have this unauthorized request mechanism, and you're allowed to use other mechanisms to inform the client about the authorization server. And then we can do that with an independent draft specifying.
Yeah, the same mechanism could also be used in random call. So it's not just resource directory.
Good. Peter?
Just want to say I agree with, I just want to say,
Yeah, it's on, but
I'm thinking off to it. Okay. I want to say that I agree this time with Karsten, especially about independent effort.
good. I was hoping for that answer. Next steps. Are we in a position for a working group last call? We've had a few interops. We are fixing mostly detailed comments.
We obviously need to get an updated draft with all of the last sets of comments
Yes.
first. August tends to be a very bad time to have a working group last call.
Yeah,
So,
It's probably-
I mean, let's shoot for September.
good.
That's one again. Did we identify versions of this document as implementation drafts? Did we already do that?
Oh, not explicitly. I'm continuously updating.
Maybe we should read that very explicitly with the next version and
Okay.
say, even though we are not starting a working class call next week, we expect this to be stable. So go ahead, please implement it.
Okay.
And tell us.
Then perhaps let me, since you've given me the occasion, get a quick word in about implementations. There is one which I wrote for unconstrained devices based in Java, based on this Californium library. There is one by Jim in C#, if I'm not mistaken. Olaf from TZI is working on a constrained implementation. Hannes says that ARM has a product that implements the client resource server interactions of the ACE framework, but does the client authorization server interactions with plain OAuth. And then there is SEI Lab at Carnegie Mellon University, who have both an unconstrained version based on my code, but with their own add-ons, and a constrained version that we almost got to interop with yesterday. And we made giant leaps forward on that one, I was told. I'm completely incompetent in embedded programming, so I'm no big help there, but they're very close to being able to provide that. So we have a number of implementations flying around, but the more the merrier. Please go ahead. I think as there are a number of implementations, the document is in a state where you can implement meaningful things, and I don't expect changes that will totally break your code to a way where you need to start again from scratch. So go ahead, feel free. If you want to get in touch with me, please do that. I will be more than happy to help you. We want to do more interops, virtual interops as well. So go ahead, hit us. Thank you very much.
Okay, so to wrap it up, the plan is we're going to wait this month. We're going to run through this month and give a pause in August, and in September we're going to start the working group last month.
Right, and by then I will address Jim's last set of comments and the questions we raised during this interop or hackathon.
So we'll have one more draft at the end.
Yeah, at least.
At least one more. Yeah. All right, thank you. Okay, so next up on the agenda, Ludwig, or I'm sorry, Francesca, you were going to talk about some of the group communications. Let's get your slides up here.
So, hello, everybody. I'm Francesca. I'm going to talk about the key provisioning for group communication using ACE draft. So this is now in version 0.1. It was presented during last IETF for the first time. Yes, so just one slide to recap what this was about. This is a draft about joining secure group communication. So how a client can become a member of a group and start securely communicating with the group. So the picture is the architecture that we're using. So there is the client, the AES, the key distribution center, which is the node that does the key distribution, and then the group members and the dispatcher. So we define in this draft a message format to authorize and distribute key material, and we make use of the ACE framework and profiles. What is out of scope of this draft is how the group communication protection is done. So what is the mechanism used to protect the group communication? And in this version of the draft, we have added this revocation and renewal of key material, which was very general in the version before. Although the algorithm, the details are still out of scope. So for status update of this draft, we have updated according to review and discussion at IETF 101. So there are some minor details that have been updated, such as the format of some parameters like get public keys, which is the parameter that is sent to from the client to the key distribution center to say, I want the public keys of these nodes. So now we have a way to send these either to request all the public keys of all the members of the group or to request specific public keys. And then we have added an expiration parameter. So this is a new COSI key parameter that was not described in other drafts before. So this is for the symmetric key for the group communication. Then the major update in this draft is about the retrieval of updated key material. So just a reminder, when there is a revocation or a self-removal of a node, of a member of a group, this triggers a rekeying from the key distribution center that just sends the new key to the current members of the group. So now we have also added this section to describe how a current member could request an update key material that can be both for the symmetric key or for the public keys, in case, for example, we missed this rekeying. Yeah, for the symmetric key, either, for example, if the key expired or there was a reboot or misrekeying, then it just requests this symmetric key to the key distribution center, and the format of this message is just, it contains the scope parameter that is the same as the original key distribution request when the node first joined the groups. And to get the public keys of the group members, the current group members, for example, if there is a new member joining, then the client sends this scope and also the get public keys parameter. So as for open issues, now with my co-author, we have some questions for you, and about this part specifically. So to retrieve either the symmetric key or the public keys, we use the same format that the client first used when it joins the group, which is this key distribution request. And we simplified because we don't need to send all the parameters that we sent when we first joined the group. We only need to send this scope or scope and get public keys. So as of now, we have defined these two different requests to update the key material, either the symmetric or the public keys. But as of now, it is not possible to combine these two requests because it's not possible to differentiate between asking for both the symmetric keys and the public keys or asking only for the public keys. So we have thought about it a little bit. So we have 3 choices right now we came up with, possibly 4. So one solution would be, if we want to be able to combine these two, is to use different endpoints. You could have one endpoint for asking a symmetric key, you could have one endpoint for public, and one for both.
Resource?
Sorry?
Resource? Endpoint is the server.
Yes, I'm using the ACE terminology now that uses endpoint as resource. Yes, for core is resource. So this is one choice. Another choice is to add one additional parameter that could indicate, yes, I also want to ask for the symmetric, and you could use that if you want to ask for both. Another choice is maybe we don't need to combine those two. It's fine when asking each one of those separately. There is also a possibility to have a special format for some parameter to differentiate between those two requests. Yeah, that's what we see. So we wanted to ask the working group opinion about this.
Jim Schott is an individual. Is this, if I'm a little bit lost here, is the symmetric one here asking for this an updated symmetric key as opposed to when you're actually doing the join?
Yes. So I have this. This is the key distribution request and response when the node first does the join. And then we use this request and response, but simplified when the node wants to request an update of this key material. So yes.
Based purely on simplicity, I would not be in favor of having multiple resources to do this.
Okay.
I'd far rather do it in the request itself.
Yes, agreed. Do you think, would you have a preference on using one additional parameter in the message itself or formatting differently, just to differentiate between I want to, because as you can see, when we do the key distribution request for only the symmetric key, we only need to send the scope, and it's optional actually. If we want to ask for the public keys, we do need to send the scope and the get public keys. So if you want to combine those two, you cannot really say if you just want to ask for the public keys or for both.
I'd have to think about it.
Okay. That's good.
Are there any other folks that want to provide feedback on the three options?
Is this even something that is interesting, or is it something we should work on? Or okay, maybe we will send an email in the mailing list and see. Yeah. So that was it. Yeah. So okay, we will do that. And I also wanted to quickly present the update to the PubSub profile, which is dependent on this previous draft.
Peter van der Stok.
Yes. Sure.
I'm very sorry, but can you hear me now? Okay, Peter van der Stok, I want to ask some question. There are two drafts now, I think, about the group communication. I find it very difficult to understand why there are two drafts, why there is not one draft. I think one draft, listen to is, makes it much clearer the importance of the group communications, of which I very much approve. I'm looking forward to all also, and I hope it to get more attention and more visible. I hope that making one draft, this the key questions in it.
Thank you for your comment. There is two drafts about group communication, which is the one I presented and the one that Marco will present. It's not, this separation was done following comments at 2 IETFs ago. So, and the first draft, which is the one I just presented, is the general one, while the one that Marco will present after me is the one that actually does the details and specify everything. Yeah.
I believe the feedback from the working group, just to reiterate what you said, the group was suggesting to split the concept from some of the details, and that's why.
And this was done also because the general one, which is the one I just presented, can also is also valid for the PubSub. So this is like there is a general one and two applications of it. So I understand that there is many drafts. There is the framework, and then the general profile, and then the specific profile.
Peter van der Stok again. I understand the PubSub argument, so that you can prepare and that you have the two drafts and not use similar technology. I'm still a bit worried about having to. I already expressed it.
Yeah. So if more people think that we should go back to have one draft, like we are doing what the working group wants. So I am all for readability. So.
Yeah, I mean, again, to repeat, these are individual drafts right now. When we start talking about working group drafts, we can make the harder decisions potentially about how to combine text or perhaps leave it as is. So we're not there yet.
So now about the PubSub profile, we have updated according to the previous draft, and nothing major. It's just updated according to this. And there has been interest in previous meetings. There has been a couple of reviews. So my question is, what is the next step? So this is a question to the chair. And
The next step is to actually get the OAuth authorization draft published before we pick up new work.
Okay. So, but this just for the record, this is stable and there has been no major change. Thank you.
feedback or further conversation on either of these two drafts? Okay, thank you, Francesca. Pivoting now, Marco.
Hello, can you hear me and see me?
Affirmative, yes, we can.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'll give a quick update on this document presented at earlier IETF meetings describing how to use the ACE framework and its profiles to join groups where communications are secured using OSCORE. Next, please. Yeah, these updates are mostly due to synchronizing this document with the latest updated version of OSCORE group.com, describing how to actually secure communications in the group, and to the document Francesca has just presented, describing the generic message format to be used for key provisioning for group communication. And last but not the least, we processed a very helpful review we got from Peter van der Stok right after IETF 101. Thanks a lot for that. Going through the updates, we had to touch the terminology a little bit already to align it with Group OSCORE in the first place. What used to be called multicaster as a group member sending out requests to the group is now simply requester, like in Group OSCORE now, just not to stress anymore specific multicast traffic, but just group traffic. We kept instead pure listener and listener with the same meaning as before. Now pure listener aligned with silent server in Group OSCORE. We cannot not use client and server now here when it comes to sending messages around. Otherwise, there is confusion with the meaning of client and server in ACE. Then consistently also with ACE key group.com, we had to touch some parameters in the messages exchanged in different phases, like in authorization request, we had removed the parameter get pub keys because there's no reason for the joining node to tell explicitly the authorization server about its interest of getting public keys of group members later on from the KDC, meaning the OSCORE group manager. Next slide, please. We adjusted also the join response consistently with ACE key group.com, especially to the addition of the X parameter to signal where the K parameter of the COSI key is going to expire, in this case the OSCORE master secret in particular, and after that there's supposed to be a renewal of the key material in the group. We also clarified something that was missing as to the client ID parameter, which is supposed to be used to provide to the joining node the endpoint ID assigned by the group manager, and there are some cases where it can be in fact omitted, and we clarify which ones of those. Next, please. Then there were also, out of Peter's review, a lot of editorial polishing and improvements related to terminology in OSCORE, the ACE framework, and the ACE profile, and especially the interaction between the ACE actors. We clarify also about the possible dynamic nature of the group identifier as described in the main Group OSCORE document. It can be composed of a fixed part, prefix, and the dynamic part, epoch, that is supposed to be changed upon each renewal of key material in the group. So essentially, the joining node is supposed to get the actual current updated group identifier from the group manager, the resource server here, only upon joining and interacting with the group manager through the server ID parameter of the COSI key. And then there's something that is right now aligned, but is more of an open point, actually. Now, this is consistent with the main Group OSCORE document, where we admit the group manager to both be or not be, depending on your setting, the repository of public key of group members. So right now we are contemplating two possibilities consistently. In Peter's review, there was also a comment, and personally I agree with that, that for the sake of this document describe how to join an OSCORE group using ACE, it's probably better also for the sake of implementations to consider only one alternative. So we just go for the group manager being the repository of public key, and that's it. So I tend to favor Peter's opinion. I also wonder what the group thinks about that, and in case we should just limit the option to the group manager's repo of public keys. Next slide, please. And this is in fact the last one. So this update was the result of discussions out of IETF 101, Peter's review. Thanks again for that. And of course, alignment with the latest version of OSCOR GroupCom and the SKI GroupCom that Francesca presented. So authors believe this is in principle in a good shape to take a step forward with adoption. Thanks a lot.
Discussion, feedback from the group?
I just want to express my interest in these drafts and that the group communication for us is really important and hope these drafts can go forward nicely and smoothly in this working group. Peter van der Stok.
Thanks, Peter.
Others? So with this draft, we're going to do the same thing as we discussed when Francesca was presenting. We're going to defer some of the conversation about how we do the adoption until some of the framework material is completed. So progress continues, but we won't working with adopt this until the other documents are more mature. Okay, thanks, Marco. Appreciate it.
Thank you all.
All right, so next up, we're going to have a more kind of open-ended discussion. We want to talk about resource directory authorization, and Peter and Carsten are going to guide us through that conversation. But before we get into that, we just wanted to tee up that after this presentation is done, we're going to ask some questions. Is this something that the working group should be kind of examining? We think this is a cross-cutting issue. We're very, very interested in hearing kind of from you as to kind of what your thoughts are. So Peter, Carsten, get your slides up here.
So sorry.
It's a team effort.
I used official Adobe PDF, etc. You don't know about it, yeah. Okay, very good. Some motivation. Within the resource directory, which we do in the core working group, we have not really looked at security aspects. Hannes very rightly said that we should look at the security aspects, especially with the fact that we have names for the endpoints which we administrate, and those names are unique. So what I wanted to propose here is that we do not do normative text in the resource directory about how the security problems should be solved, but actually it might be well to have an example which gives guidelines and ideas how this should be done, such that we are not confronted later on with very weird implementations which do not actually solve the problem. Okay. So we are looking forward to, as said by you, to discussions, and if the working group wants to continue this work or comment on it. Well, the threat is a very simple one. An endpoint, used as a server in this case, registers with a unique endpoint name. Assume we have two A and B. This is the very short version of the threat as discussed in the resource directory with name A1 and B1. Suppose B is malicious and B registers with name A1. And when A wants to register with A1, the resource directory tell you, no, don't go. And in Hannes' words, this is toast. We are very badly off. So the idea is then to suggest an authorization server, and we ask the authorization server, the client who wants to register, ask the authorization server for a token in which he is authorized with this token to actually register his entries. That's the idea. The way I construct the example is that I will use the application CBOR media format, that DTLS is used. that the client asks for the tokens for the AS with sufficient information to do it, and I will come back to that further. I'm very happy for Steffi's remark, who tells me that I used a way to express the endpoint names, and she says, why don't you use the scope? But other people have other suggestions, as I understood. So what is the client background for the example I chose is that it has a certificate installed, so I'm not looking at raw public keys, etc. But well, there was a suggestion for that, but then we have to have mappings. I looked into the mappings, I got overwhelmed, and so I keep it to this. Actually, the example is EST Co-op S. It is an extension of Brisky, where we assume that a device has been installed with a certificate. What we want to do is that the endpoint name equals the certificate identifier. So when the endpoint says, look here, I want to register with this endpoint name, this can be by the server, can be authorization server, this can be verified from the certificate. I have here an example of a certificate to the right. Don't put too much attention on it. The idea is that you have a unique certificate identifier which comes from the CN field and the serial number field. Yeah, it's difficult to read. We have three, so the scope name suggestions. So what should be the value of the scope? We have three cases. One is where an endpoint registers itself with this endpoint name. We have a third-party commissioning tool, which actually registers also an EP name. And we have an update of registrations, which is not completely worked out in the resource directory yet, but is coming there. In all of them, I have the scope. I have three different actions. One is the EP registration for the endpoint registers itself. One is the commissioning tool does it. And in it, you will find the EP name and the EP sector, which is actually optional. And okay, the EP name is the essential part here. Clear up till now? Yeah. I hope so. So the values of the EP name and the sector which are suggested is that for the EP name, we use the certificate identifier, which we take from the certificate. And the EP sector is actually configured in the authorization server for given certificate identifiers. So it should be knowing that a certain endpoint can ask for this EP name within this sector. And here is a wrong example. So this is a CWT example. So we have when we send this to the resource server, yeah, we have this the destination of the token. In this case, the resource directory, in expiration times, etc., and then the scope, which is the EP registration, which is we want this endpoint to register with the unique name Fairhair, not even for Sexer, and no sector uit. And we have the COSA key, and I think those COSA key can actually be taken probably from the public key, which is also stored in the certificate, so that you can actually verify that the one who's asking for the claim is actually also the possessor of the key. This is what I wanted to see, and I wanted to act that as an example. If the example as proposed here is not secure or does not fulfill the conditions, I really like to hear about it, or if you have other ways to solve it, I also really like to hear about it. This is it. I hope the question was clear.
Hi, Jonathan Hamill from CSE. Typically for certificate identifiers, in the case of CMS, you use issuer and serial number rather than company.
I didn't get the last one, sorry.
Sorry, for certificate identifiers to align with things like CMS, typically you'd use issuer and serial number rather than company.
Yeah.
Mohit, so I wonder if I'm the only one who thinks this is way too complex for a problem that we have seen before in many places. So when you do IPv6 neighbor discovery, you have the same problem that you use your MAC address, but hey, someone else could come and claim your MAC address and register an address. And what you do is you simply use a random identity. And even from a privacy point of view, that I would encourage using something that's completely random. So I don't see why you can't just use a random endpoint name and register it, and then the next guy comes and uses a completely random endpoint name. What issues do you run into? What kind of limitations do you have on the endpoint name? Does it have to be human readable, human understandable? Like, I don't see the point why it has to go to another party now and say, can I use this endpoint name, get a proof, then go back and say, yes, you are able to use this endpoint name. I think this is way too complex.
Thanks for the comment.
This is Hannes. So initially, the problem we started out was, yeah. So the initial problem we wanted, or I tried to address, was that an IoT device that uses RD talked to that RD and provided its endpoint name or some identifier in two different layers. It provided it at the DTLS layer in the certificate, and it again provided it in the co-op, in the co-op layer with the RD. In the TLS layer, it used cryptographic authentication, so whatever you said previously about whatever identifier is in there, and some people may use serial numbers, others may not, but it doesn't matter. But then the problem was really that at the higher layer, you had another identifier which was not authenticated. So my proposal was get rid of the duplicated identifier at the application layer that is not authenticated. Your solution, however, is different. You are then going back to the to an authorization server, which then binds the stuff that is in the certificate with what is being presented at the application layer. This would also, of course, be another possibility.
Yes. Okay.
If you make sure that the identifier you pass in RD as an endpoint name is equal to what the stuff that you provide in the certificate,
Yes.
then there wouldn't be a problem.
Okay.
On the other hand, that begs the question of like, why do you need to send both the same information twice as well, and to then later compare it to then actually just look at the stuff that you are authenticating in the first place. So there is a lot.
I understand what you said. I misunderstood in the beginning.
Matthias Kovac, Siemens. Yeah, I agree with that. So in that sense, I wanted to ask, to my understanding, you present here one way that is ACE related, but there are also other ways how to do a secure or authorized registration. Is that correct?
Not that I know by heart, but okay. I want to look at the DTLS suggestion. Yeah.
Okay. So because I would expect from, well, it's the discussion from the core mailing list about RD, but that there is, for instance, also just a certificate-based way. So if the client has a certificate, that there's a field where basically the endpoint name comes from, and it's proven that you possess that name.
Yeah.
And this is one way. Another way could be that you have something like this token, so that some external authority says, yeah, you are allowed to use that. So meaning in general, we just need authorization for RD that is clear, and that this is just a way to use ACE for it, but there should be also other ways, like more simple ways, as Hannes proposed with certificates.
I prefer the simple basis.
Hannes again, but you do raise another interesting question, namely, is the registration, does it require some authorization? So you have the scope parameter there, which provides that information. So if you have a sort of a separate authorization server who then allows you to get the token, which indicates that you are able to do the authorization. Maybe that could be useful, but specifically for those cases where you have these, which is another feature which you didn't have in your slide, but it's in the document, is this third-party registration. I think there this mechanism comes in handy. It doesn't quite work in the way that you described, at least in my opinion, because you have a third party who registers a bunch of different endpoints in sort of one shot. And there's of course there's the question of like, how do you actually secure this? And currently the spec says out of band. And that was also one of the other comments, because people said, oh, we can't do this matching for these endpoints because we have this third-party registration, which I agree is true, but I don't know what the security story there is.
Okay. Thanks for the pointer. No.
Yes, can you do that?
Oh, yes. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
That's why it's there.
Okay, so I watched this discussion, and during the entire discussion, I had no idea what we were trying to do. So I took one step back and tried to find out what are we trying to do. Next slide. And generally in the IETF, we do know how to protect things. We have a great toolkit for protecting things. We usually have 3 mechanisms that we just need to choose from. But we often then protect the wrong things. And I think it's really important to understand what are actually the objectives that we are trying to protect. And of course, typically people who come from a specific environment are stuck in some ways of doing things that are wonderfully secure because they protect all the objectives that they happen to protect, but they don't solve the problem. So that's a bit the point of view that I'm coming from here, and I don't have solutions here, I only have questions. But I think it's worth to take this stand for a while. Next slide, please. So all the discussion on the mailing list was about the endpoint name, which is kind of useful if you're sitting in front of a management station and want to know whether that thing over there actually still works or not. But it's not quite clear that this is actually something we care about very much. So like Mohit said, just use a random one and we're done. So the assumption here seems to be that the resource directory requires authorization for registration under an endpoint name. But the resource directory does not care at all about what is registered under this name. And okay, the fact that a particular endpoint registered something probably also protects changes to that, so that only that endpoint can change. So that's a useful thing to have. But it's still not quite clear whether the second bullet here, the resource directory doesn't care about what is registered under that name, actually solves our objectives. Next slide, please. So what are potential threats? And I certainly didn't try to be exhaustive here, but just as a simple example. So if you don't control the attributes that you actually register together with the other information for an endpoint, then of course I can register something under another node's IP address, for instance. So I can put in a registration that has the wrong attributes in it. Or I could also for myself claim the wrong attributes. I'm the temperature sensor for room 405. So in those cases where it's important that the discovery process, which uses the resource directory, actually finds the things that need to be found, I think this is not good. Next slide. So yeah, on the other hand, endpoint names are kind of not so important. I don't care how the temperature sensor in room 405 is named. I might have an application where I have a semantic endpoint name and so on. Then it starts to make more sense. But if I have a random one, it's just not that important. And actually, we have designed the resource directory in such a way that the endpoint name isn't even visible to someone looking at the resource directory. So protecting it is kind of beside the point. Next slide. So really, and I'm sorry, we spent the weekend talking about semantics, so maybe I'm a little bit on a particular rail here, but do we have to talk about protecting semantics? So does the authorization that we get from an authorization server maybe have to include the fact that the authorization in this case is for a temperature sensor. And no, you cannot say you are a refrigerator when you are a temperature sensor. Or does it include, that would be intrinsic semantics. Or can you limit registrations to some extrinsic semantics, like you are the temperature sensor in room 405 and not the one in 406. And what we need to do, not today and not here, but what we ultimately need to understand is we need to represent those authorization semantics in our authorization data structures. And the only place we have right now is the scope. And that might be a little bit too unwieldy because it's just a string. You cannot put structured information in there. So maybe we have to think about other scope-like claims that clarify what the authorization is for. There are also other proposals for authorization information formats and so on. I just want to point out that there's a lot of things that we may want to put into the CWT, and we haven't even started yet. Hannes.
Carsten, thanks for the presentation. It's interesting, but I think you are sort of like shuffling the problem around in some sense. You know, like the discussion we started off is, do we need this endpoint name? And the answer then cannot be, oh, there are all these other things that we could, there are security issues, couldn't we talk about them instead? I want to solve this endpoint name thing first. And yes, there's important issues with devices, device attestation, and sort of making sure that the sensor data is indeed not tampered with, and there's all sorts of very complicated problems, some of them which are unsolvable, because you can, even if the sensor data is correct, you may put, for example, a candle next to a temperature sensor and
Yes.
it will give you incorrect values.
Sure, sure.
But so I think if we could just solve the somewhat simple, very much RD-related question of what is the semantics of the endpoint name. And I fear, and I haven't verified it, if I go and pick up Leshan as one example implementation, if I mess around with the value, I will then suddenly get that server to trick me into doing things like I ask him to do server-side key generation for my device, which in fact I'm just faking someone else's device, and it gives me the keys for that device, which is someone else's device, and that would not be good.
Yeah, I think the problem we are going to run into if we just solve the protection of the endpoint name is that people are going to start encoding the semantics that they actually need and that actually want to project into those endpoint names. And I mean, we are seeing this in real world deployments, so this is not hypothetical. So in the end, we are starting to define a semantic language for our nodes encoded in endpoint names. And that's probably not a good thing to have. Jim.
Jim Schott is an individual. CWT actually expanded the scope to be a binary value. So you're not restricted to just strings. We can actually have structured data. So that is probably not as unwieldy as what you are currently suggesting. There is a potential problem in that we don't have any sort of standardized idea of how to structure data, but that's a different issue.
I think we have many of them and not just one.
Yeah.
Certainly not zero.
Right, but we don't have A
Right.
either. So I'm trying to figure out two things here. One is, are we asking the group to solve a particular problem here dealing with resource directories?
No.
Or are we trying to use this as an example of a more general problem, in which case I'm having a problem, from Peter's presentation, I'm having a problem of understanding what the general problem is. I've got a bit more of an of an idea from your presentation what you think the general problem is. Can you give me a 3-sentence description of what you think the general problem should be?
I think Carrie has one.
Terry Lynn. I think the general problem is the following. We're used to DNS, right? And the fact that when you go to DNS, you can even get like a set answer about the contents of a zone file in DNS. But DNSSEC doesn't say anything about the actual veracity of the information that's in that zone file. We assume that there's a human administrator in the loop, or that there's a trusted element that puts things in there dynamically. So we're talking about a case where things basically come out of the box, and they need to be able to represent to other clients what they actually, the services they actually provide. And we want that to be accurate information, or we want it to be trusted information. So I think that's the general problem.
So that's good. Can we restate that in the 3 sentences? Because I mean, I don't mean to put you on the spot. I mean, this is in a sense the meandering conversation we wanted to have. Is the problem this small? Is the problem kind of much kind of larger? And where's the appetite?
I can put it into one sentence. There's no human in the loop. Okay, so how can you be sure of the veracity of the information? So I actually have a question while I was in line, so I'll get back on this one.
Well, I mean, that's in a sense what we need to finesse. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
So regarding questions would be protect endpoint or semantics. I think it's obviously difficult and it's more a matter of time frames. Hannes is a good point. We have a problem right now which we need to solve, but then I think the problem should be solved when it does have a nice way forward on how we address the semantics. We're already using today a lot of endpoint things with semantics. I made there or something else that you actually use to find your devices. And I do like the idea of having a way in the an RD document to protect that, but it shouldn't be the only way, because in current deployments we already have ways to cover it. Just have those using the mechanisms. So I think as long as we take those into account,
Yeah. So the original assumption was that there is some way that authorization servers and resource directory are coupled in such a way that all this can be done behind the scenes. And what we are doing now is trying to understand how can we reduce that coupling and actually have a resource directory maybe interact with authorization servers of very different kinds and still collect information in one place that has some veracity to it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. As long as it's not the only.
But you can always do the tight coupling. That's the easy solution. And we don't need to write anything about it.
Carrie Lynn, Oracle +9. I have a question about, actually I have 2 questions. First, my understanding, and I could be wrong, is that the information that one finds in the resource directory could also be gotten directly from the node.
Yes.
If one does a get to well-known port. So I guess question number 1 is, should protecting this information also extend to the client itself, when you basically ask the client, what does it support? And number 2, is it possible to look at a solution like perhaps signing all the links that could come back, signing the collection of links that could come back when you query well-known port?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about well-known core is that it's very clear that the information that is in there is a claim by the device that carries that well-known core. Now, in a resource directory, we mix all this stuff up. And this mixing has a number of problems to it, because somebody who goes to the resource directory doesn't have the provenance of the information that is mixed up in that resource directory. So maybe we just have to be a bit more careful in preserving that and preserving ways for somebody who looks into a resource directory to assess the information in there. So that would be one half of the answer. The other half, of course, is a resource directory also is a shared resource, and we have to protect that shared resource. So we need to understand what attacks are in there. So somebody could masquerade as 1 million endpoint names and make it really hard to find anything in that thing. So that's also something we need to do. It's a slightly different objective. And in many environments, it's relatively easy to do this because we have a boundary around the whole system. But in the end, it must be possible to define that boundary in a way that the resource directory can actually implement that.
Jim Chen. Also, one of the issues in terms of just dealing with providence is that when you ask the resource directory for an answer, it will return bits and pieces from different places.
Yes.
So you can't actually tie your way all the way back to the original providence of what was registered.
Yeah, maybe we want to change that. So that's questions that we have to take back to the co-working group. But the reason I made these slides is that I would love CWT to be a tool that is really useful here. And your comment about scope allowing binary strings, that certainly helps. It's not the answer because we still have to say what that binary string is, but we might be able to find a reasonably general answer to that question.
For what it's worth, Ms. Hannes, I don't think the scope is actually the right thing to use to begin with. The scope is more the action you are trying to do, like register, these type of things. What you want to present here from the examples above is more like information about the device and its capabilities. So it's more about the client, different things. So it should go into different structure. In my
we are talking about a piece of authorization that is transferred from the authorization server to the resource directory. So we are talking about the scope of that authorization. And that, of course, pertains to the client that is then going to try to register with
right.
it.
But the CWT scope has different semantics. When you want to, so you could think of the resource directory in that setup in an ACE OAuth context, it would be the resource server. It makes the authorization server makes statement about the client and its capability and authorizes those, and those
Yes.
would be like claims about that client. It wouldn't be scope. Scope is I want to register. That's what the client says. I want to register at this
Yes.
specific server. The specific
Yes.
server would be the audience. The scope would be register.
Yes, exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Hi, Padu. So in terms of, I think there are multiple things. I hope I'm explaining it well. So finally, at the security layer, the endpoint name is being brought out, and then this is being transferred to an external system, where it is becoming insecure because it's out in the open. So there is always trying to find out that simple numeric name or alphanumeric name as a constant entity to be found back in the system. I think that's where this complexity is arising. So probably that we need to solve. So there is other things are like in the mobile world there is something what is internal and something what is normal MSISD, etc. Similar to that, that would be a parallel drawn here to see what is secure in the secure environment, what could be exchanged and what is exchanged outside. And the second part which I think it is important is as IETF, what is being solved is all in the systems within certain boundaries. It's not at the end-to-end or the entire. So if we are able to achieve the context, what we are talking about in that particular system between RD and a particular endpoint name, there could be same name which is being registered by 3 people, but if you are able to find a context between that endpoint and that RD, and it's not exchanged between anybody else, then that context remains constant. So even you can have 3 A1s, but with multiple identities between the RD and A1, A1, 2, A1, 3, it never mixes it up. That kind of solution could be a thing. That's what I'm saying.
So did I hear you say we need to be able to have local identifiers?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
Between the
This is Matthias. I want to go back to the argument or discussion before. So initially, I was a bit confused of the usage of scope in the proposal by Peter. And now I got even more confused saying that it's the authorization server that kind of grants, yeah, this is the right endpoint name and so on. So to step a bit back, so my understanding of all this was that we have a proof of possession token, and there I can prove that a certain claim that I as a client make
Who's I? Who's I? Never say I when you
The
talk about
client.
security. The client.
So the client can prove a certain claim with this proof of possession token. And so the overall setup would be that an authorization server can grant authorization to register at an RD, but then it's up to the client that the client proves, yeah, and I really am allowed to use this endpoint name. And that's so it would be a claim in the proof of possession token that somehow has to be proven by the means of the top token. But it's not something that is granted by the authorization server.
But you only can prove the possession of a key. So what's the relationship between the key and the endpoint name?
So there must be something like a certificate that says, yeah, this entity is allowed to use that name. And that can be imprinted on the device that as a client want to register, or it could be that this key is also available, for instance, to the commissioning tool that then can prove, yeah, I am not that endpoint that wants to register, but I'm allowed to use that endpoint name because I'm the commissioning tool on its behalf.
Yes, one assumption that maybe is underlying all this is that all the permission granting is done by authorization servers. So there is an authorization server somewhere that has granted the permission to register this as something.
So my point was to separate this. So one, so there's the obvious authorization server would be that allows a client to register with that RD.
Yes.
But that's not the authorization server that has any knowledge whether that client has the right to use that endpoint name or not. That has to come, well, initially from the client itself. It can be then proven with the POP token and so on. Or maybe we have then a more elaborate out-of-band mechanism, but it's kind of a separate track from the obvious authorization server that is only about being authorized to register at an RD.
So you would have a second issuer that actually controls the authorization for using an endpoint name.
Yes, also, and the bigger problem is also this is more complex, and there are some simple solutions that, for instance, the client that registers had a certificate that can prove that it's allowed to use that name. And if that is not enough, then we can look into some more elaborate ways. But we are entangling multiple problems in this here, to my understanding. Because, well, the obvious thing is we need some authorization to register at the RD.
Yes.
There, ACE is nice because it has this authorization server and so on. So we use it for that. Is a client allowed? But then whether the client is allowed to use that name and so on, that's something that, yeah, is under a different authority, actually.
That's fine. I think that's a useful observation that we may want to have different sources of authority here. And the namespace for endpoint names, if that is in some way valuable, that may be controlled by somebody else than the one that authorizes registration at the resource registry. I think that's an important point, yes.
Okay, and the second point was that let's start with something simple, that there is maybe some key that proves that a client is allowed to use a certain endpoint name. So to have something really simple that would also work, for instance, in just using DTLS in certificate mode, there's the endpoint name in there, and that proves that the client can register with that. So there is not even need for the authorization server or ACE.
Yeah.
So going back to kind of the simple proposal by Hannes that solves the problem at hand.
So the purpose of a certificate is to bind a name to a public key. So that would very much solve that problem,
Yeah.
yes.
And in addition, the authorization for RDs that you didn't know beforehand, for the getting authorized to actually register.
Something was missing from the sentence.
So it's 3 points. The first one was what you nicely summarized, so this observation that we might want to disentangle this. The second point was we need some simple solution right now. And the third point was that we not necessarily need an authorization server for IDs for the simple cases. But this is like the first step. And then the second step after that is thinking about maybe a second entity that can authorize what client names can be used. Chop it up a bit to get some useful methods on it.
The one little modification I would make to what you said is I wouldn't use certificates and simple in the same sentence.
Jim Schott. There's one concept that it suddenly dawned on me in resource directories that we haven't discussed here that does have some impact potentially on names, and that's groups. Because if you're doing groups, it may actually be very important that the names be predetermined rather than made up on the fly. Because the entity doing the registration may not be the entity that puts you into a group. So that's a possible thing too.
Yeah, so there are two parts of this. Somebody wants to control who is authorized to be part of a group, and a potential member of a group wants to be able to control not wanting to become a member of a group.
Dave Taylor. So I think I'm going to say some of the same things that Matthias said, so probably plus one of what he said. Going back to the problem of the first point, which is, how do you prevent a device from saying it's a different type of device, right? Authorized registration as a temporary. Yeah, so this is a problem that outside the IETF, right, Alljoin did solve this. I gave a presentation, I think, within research group like a year or two ago that talked about how they solved it with what they call capabilities. And so a lot of what Matthias is saying is sort of analogous to that. And so if you have an entity that takes care of signing the fact that a device can be a temperature sensor, that entity is your onboarding tool or whatever you're using as I'm authorizing the thing to be on my network, I'm giving it a token, I'm giving it a signature, I'm giving it a certificate, whatever it is, it's a security mechanism of choice, right? The onboarding tool says, you are authorized to be a temperature sensor. That's separate, separate from saying that whether you're allowed to register that information. I mean, you pointed out, like Tony pointed out, that DNS, you put the information in there and you don't know whether it's the correct information or not. It's whether you're authorized to put it in there is a different question. Right? So there's actually two things going on. One is when resolving information, you may or may not be using the resource directory. You might be using, multitask or whatever, and you still want the same problem to be solved, right? And so the response, whether you're getting it from the resource directory or whether you're getting it from the device itself, okay, contains some data. That's the data that you need to be able to solve at the requester level to say the information that I got back is good or not. Okay? And so even if the resource directory does not take care of that, if you had a common mechanism between the two, which is how Alljoin did it, then whether the resource directory holds bad data or not is just an efficiency issue.
Yes.
Right? Because I would throw it away in the same way as I would throw away a multicast response that's not authorized. Okay? You can then choose to say, my registration server might choose to check it the same way as any other requester would check it before I actually put it into my database. You could do that if they're from the same authority and they trust each other, like Matthias was saying. But those are two separate points.
This is Hannes. I just wanted to point out that there's a discussion about this, the so-called attestation features to address some of these problems on number one. Later today, as a pop-off, 6 p.m., I can send it to the list in case you haven't seen the list. There's a separate mailing list called EAT. Care about that discussion?
Yeah, there is a slight terminology problem there. The term attestation you just used is about signing a claim. That's what you call attestation. There is also something called attesting system health. And these are two different things. So those people who don't care about attesting system health may still want to go to the BOF this evening.
And to add to that, in Sec Dispatch, we're going to be talking about two drafts that are in the neighborhood of application.
Yes.
One of those drafts is talking about the terminology related to the space of application.
Perry Lane again. Relative to Dave's point about separating the accuracy of information from the authorization that goes into the RD, I think that potentially one derives from the other. Although that triggers in my mind this question of, do you want to limit which RD the information can actually be placed into of the set of all the RDs in the world?
I haven't actually started to talk about disclosure here. So this is all about integrity and not about privacy.
So at least the integrity question seems to be answered that if my links are signed, if everything I can do, is represented as a set of links and that set is signed, then I should be able, by the same token, to make the assertion up to the RD and say, here's my information, it's been signed, there's a chain of trust, so take it, at face value.
Okay, I think that was a useful discussion.
Yes, it was, and I appreciate the both of you facilitating this. Final word?
One final, Michael Coster, Samsung. One final comment about RD, and I've heard it a few times, is that it's written in the current draft that only what's in a well-known core should ever be registered in an RD. And I think we've been talking about using an RD to apply additional semantics to the context of things also. So we need to figure out if that needs the same protection.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ben Kaduk, thanks for having this discussion. It's really great to hear the thoughts being bounced around. This is, I can't use the word scope, this is a slightly different topic than we've usually been covering. So we might need to think about if we need to recharter to actually take on work in this area. I'm not actually sure yet.
Agreed. So we were not naive enough coming into this conversation that we would get any class of really kind of resolution and we would get to the point where we could have a consensus call. But just randomly aggregating some of the things I heard, as to what is even the problem, so we can narrow down, not using the word scope, but narrow down what the it is, so we can make a decision whether we want to work on it, and whether it is within the charter. I mean, are we just talking about something narrow related to endpoints? Is that just an exemplar of a general problem? What is the link between that endpoint discussion and the general problem? Then ... what is the general problem we want to solve? So that's on the table. Then we just briefly had a conversation of, are we trying to solve an integrity issue? Are we trying to solve a privacy issue? Probably kind of both, but at what level? Is it an ACE? Are we using other constructs? We also had a discussion about what does a solution look like relative to that? Are we talking about a way versus the way? So do we want some flexibility into potentially doing this multiple ways? Wow, there's a little echo there. Then just noting in the solution, regardless of whether it's one solution or a solution, we need to make sure we consider group communications, a topic we talked about a little earlier, and we heard multiple folks provide feedback of keep it simple. Which may or may not be kind of possible given that we haven't made any decisions, but that was a mantra that was heard a couple times. So in that wrap up, if I missed one of your key themes as you came up to the mic, I mean, please kind of do correct me. All right, so we're going to need more conversation about this, potentially not just kind of here in ACE. Okay, so next up is we added a last thing kind of to the agenda that was not previously in the mail list to talk about ad hoc. Yeah, get your slides. We need a second.
So, well, I think we can start. Thank you for keeping the discussion short so we could have a short update on ad hoc. So we've been doing some progress since last face-to-face meeting, and I'd like to share some of the points with you coming up really soon now. I hope.
Here we go. Sorry about that.
Okay, next slide, please. So the two main updates since last meeting is the first one is the formal verification. Thank you. Formal verification. So we have been working together with people at the IT University of Copenhagen and doing a formal verification of version 08. And it turns out it has the expected security properties in terms of strong authentication, forward secrecy, and so on. So there was one concern about app 2, that's the data, the application layer data carried in message 2. We have addressed that in the latest version of the protocol. So I think this is one good resolution of one of the discussion points in the face-to-face meeting on the formal properties of the protocol. And then another major update into the protocol is that we have made further reduction of the message size. So for the row public key authenticated Diffie-Hellman, that's the two rightmost columns. Here's a comparison with TLS 1.3. And you can see it's essentially it's less than half the number of bytes in total. Whereas for the PSK authenticated Diffie-Hellman, it's actually a third of the message size, the message total number of bytes, which is then can be mapped to the frames, number of frames in terms of, and then in turn to latency and power consumption. So some more details of the changes that we made. So we renamed the app2 parameter to unprotected additional data, just to illustrate that this data, this was the comment from the formal verification, that this data is actually not protected. It's not authentic. Well, it's not authenticated. Party U is not authenticated at the point when this data is being sent. That's one way we address that comment. And the other comments here are also input from various reviews. We made the session identifier optional when the underlying layer can be used to enable the binding. So for example, when co-op is used. That was a comment by Jim in the previous review. We changed raw public key format from X509 to COSI key, which reduces the message size and also allows the use of key identifier. Another comment from Jim is that we always integrity protect the whole credential, so the certificate or the COSI key. And then there were a number of other changes for the reduction of overhead, following the request from applications that they actually need a more lightweight handshake. This is from Sixdish and also for applications using narrowband IoT, which is this cellular low data rate access. And I'd like to add to that for people working with IoT security, we can still today hear 2018 that some companies want to deploy IoT without security because they find the overhead problematic for latency and for other reasons. So that's actually the reason why we're doing this work, and we think that this is going at least aiding in the overhead aspect of that. So here are the other changes in terms of reduced overhead. And the first point I'd like to stress here, we'd like to have a discussion around, is that we are actually removing the nonces from the protocol. So this is the previous version of the protocol. We had nonces, but we allow the reuse of ephemeral keys. In this version of the protocol, we remove the nonces and do not allow the reuse of ephemeral keys. So this may be a contentious point, but we're happy to discuss. We think it's in the interest of reducing overhead, this is valuable, but I'm sure that someone will comment on that. There are certainly pedagogic issues, pedagogic reasons to keep the nonces here. And we'd like to have a discussion about the security aspects as well. Another thing is that we don't send the entire ephemeral key. We only send the X coordinate, the curve algorithm, the ciphertext, and the encrypted signature instead of the full COSI structures. So this is actually in line with what OSCORE is doing, and it's in line with what was requested to the mailing list to do in the OSCORE profile. So 6TiSCH has a problem fitting it into the frames. And instead of carrying the entire COSI object, you pick out the important parts and you recreate the COSI object at the receiver side. And that gives a good last compression of the message. We use array indices to specify chosen algorithms, which is also another technique for reducing overhead. And last but not least, we use sequential CBOR elements instead of arrays. And perhaps that was actually least. Anyway, so that's the type of changes that led to this low overhead. The next steps is to ensure that the formal verification of version 08 actually holds also for these changes in 09. Most changes are not with respect to the security properties of the protocol. This overhead was more like the formats, but we still need to complete the formal verification and update the security considerations. And more reviews are very welcome. Any questions or comments?
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Okay, administratively, most important, where are the blue sheets? Has everyone signed the blue sheets? So I see some folks need to sign in the back, so if you could move things move the side up to the back. We have a couple minutes for open mic. Is there anything anyone wants to talk about? Going once. Going twice. Okay. Somebody just pull up what some of the decisions were of the working group here. Let me just read them off. Okay, so when we were talking about the CWT proof of possession kind of draft about what the next step was related to that, the authors are going to look at what was posted on the mailing list kind of last week that summarized what are some of the outstanding issues, and that will be the steps necessary for further progression. Then in talking about the OAuth authorization kind of framework, another draft is going to be published in kind of the August timeframe, when we're going to go working group last call in September. There were a number of drafts, individual drafts we talked about relative to group communication. We decided we're going to continue kind of working on those, but we're going to defer working group adoption until some of the framework documents are complete. We had a very robust discussion around resource directory kind of authorization. As I have kind of wrapped up, there were some issues of what's the real problem, which part of the problem, what are kind of solutions, and we're going to have to continue discussing that a little more. So that's everything that came out of the working group. So any, again, final kind of thoughts to the mic? We have a little bit of time. Otherwise, we're going to be done. Okay, in that case, thanks so much, everyone. See you on the mailing list.